Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we have the Intel Core i5 9400F on hand for some testing because so many of you have requested that I check out this CPU. So we took some of our Patreon money and, well, we bought one. So I have it and I can give you some benchmarks. A lot of you have requested that I compare it with the Ryzen 5 2600 or 2600X. And since I just benchmarked the 2600X, that is the CPU I'll be using. And yeah, we're going to see how this compares to the Ryzen 5 2600X. Truth be told, this isn't a particularly exciting processor. At least it's not really new. It's 100 megahertz faster than the Core i5 8400, a CPU that we quite like and have already tested fairly extensively on the channel. There is one other change. It's not a straight refresh with a slight factory overclock. There is one other reasonably significant change. The Intel UHD Graphics 630 has been disabled, and therefore the 9400F has no form of integrated graphics, just like the Ryzen 5 2600X, for example. This is meant to make the 9400F cheaper than the Core i5 8400, though oddly Intel lists the MSRP as $182 US, and that's the same MSRP as the 8400. So on paper, the 9400F and 8400 should have the same retail price. Thankfully though, for the 9400F, that isn't the case, at least currently anyway. Right now, the 9400F can be had for $175 US or $280 Australian. Meanwhile, the Core i5 8400 costs $215 US or $320 Aussie. And this makes the newer 9400F about 20% cheaper. It also means it's cheaper than the Ryzen 5 2600X, which is currently retailing for $190 US or $310 Australian. So the question so many of you guys have been asking me is, which one should you buy? Well, recently in a top 5 CPU video, I said I'd personally go with the Ryzen 5 2600X as it comes with a much better box cooler, can be overclocked, and the AM4 platform offers a significantly better upgrade path. I don't think that assessment was wrong, but now that I have the Core i5 9400F on hand, I thought why not run a few up-to-date benchmarks. For this one, the focus will be on gaming performance. When it comes to applications, you can just check out our day one coverage of the 2600X. We featured the Core i5 8400 in that one, and you can safely bet that the 2.5% factory overclock isn't going to make the 9400F any more than 1 to 2% faster. That said, before the video's over, I will take a slightly closer look at reviewish type things, like operating temperatures for the Core i5 9400F using the box cooler, and we'll just see how it gets on. The main event though will be, of course, the 18 game benchmark using the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. The 4K results should show GPU bound gaming, and then this will simulate what you could expect to see with a lower end GPU at a lower resolution. There is 2 test configurations for each CPU. The Core i5 9400F, that'll be tested with the standard Intel box cooler for both configurations on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Master. The base configuration uses 16GB of DDR4 2666 CL15 memory, as this is what you'll be limited to on any motherboard that's not using a Z370 or Z390 chipset. Then we have an overclocked configuration using DDR4 3400 memory. Of course, you can't overclock the CPU cores, but on these Z-series chipsets, you can use faster memory. Then we have the Ryzen 5 2600X, which has been tested on the Gigabyte X470 Aorus Gaming 7 Wi-Fi using the standard box cooler for the base test with 16GB of DDR4 3400 CL15 memory. Now, the reason I'm using faster memory for the base configuration for the Ryzen 5 2600X is quite simply because this CPU isn't limited to the kind of memory you can use apart from physical limitations of the integrated memory controller. But if you spend $20 or $30 more, you can use DDR4 3400 memory, and we strongly recommend you get a faster memory for the Ryzen processor. Not worth saving $20 or $30 if you're seeking maximum performance. Then we do have a second configuration, which is overclocked to 4.2 GHz on all cores, and we've tightened the memory subtimings and installed the Corsair Hydro Series H115i. Finally, all the benchmark data is fresh and was gathered within the same week for this video. It's basically impossible for me to get all this testing done faster than that, so it is what it is. Anyway, I think it's time that I stop rambling on and we jump into the benchmarks. Starting things off, we have Warhammer Vermintide 2, and here we see at 1080p, for maximum frame rates, the 9400F was 13% faster than the 2600X when comparing base configurations. Overclocking the 2600X pushed it ahead of the base 9400F for the 1% low figure, but then pairing the Intel processor with faster memory was enough to get it back on par for the 1% low and ahead for the average frame rate. Similar margins were seen at 1440p, and then quite interestingly at 4K, the 2600X was a fraction faster. In fact, quite a bit faster when overclocked with finely tuned memory timings. You'd expect the results here to be all identical, as we are, or at least should be, 100% GPU limited, but that wasn't the case. Moving on, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I wasn't expecting the Ryzen 5 processor to do particularly well here, so for me at least, the results are very surprising. The faster memory didn't really help the 9400F, while the overclock boosted the 2600X's average frame rate by 9%. Moving to 1440p, and here we are GPU limited, and then of course, much the same as seen at 4K. Moving on, the Core i5 9400F was a little more punchy in Fortnite, but overall the margins weren't that significant. For example, the fastest configurations were separated by a mere 4% at 1080p. Naturally, the margin was reduced even further at 1440p, and then at 4K we had somewhat of a stalemate. The 9400F was a whisker faster in Apex Legends, nothing really worth getting too excited about though. Essentially, you're looking at the exact same experience with either CPU. If you're for some reason seeking big frame rates in Resident Evil 2, then it seems like the Ryzen 5 2600X is the CPU to get, at least over the Core i5 9400F anyway. At 1080p in their base configurations, the 2600X was 8% faster and then 6% faster when tweaked for maximum performance. That said, these margins were effectively eliminated at 1440p and 4K, so for the vast majority of you, these CPUs will deliver the exact same experience in this title. Here's another example of where the 9400F was faster, but generally only by a small margin. When testing with Just Cause 4, the Intel CPU was up to 8% faster when comparing similar configurations. That said, the 1% low results were much the same. Once again, the margins were mostly eliminated at 1440p and then completely eliminated at 4K. Has to be said, Hitman 2 is a horrible title for AMD, and while the 1% low performance was competitive, the average frame rates did slip quite a bit. Has to be said, this title is really bizarre when it comes to the relationship between the CPU and GPU, though I'd say we are mostly CPU bound at 1080p and 1440p. Project Cars 2 is another non-AMD friendly title, but overall the results here aren't that bad for the Ryzen 5 2600. In fact, they're actually quite good. Again, we are CPU limited at the 1080p and 1440p resolutions, while things mostly come together at 4K. Like so many of the games we've looked at so far, the Core i5 9400F does pull slightly ahead at 1080p in Rainbow Six Siege for the average frame rate, but the 1% low figures are very similar. There really is very little difference between these two CPUs at 1080p, and then basically no difference at 1440p and 4K. Okay, so the Battlefield 5 results are really quite interesting. For repeatability and accuracy, we're using the single-player campaign here. I've done multiplayer testing in the past, but it's really difficult to gather accurate data, and since that testing, the game has seen numerous patches that address performance. Anyway, the single-player portion of the game mimics the slight issue we saw with the 9400F in multiplayer, so I suppose that's good. The experience with the 9400F certainly wasn't bad. In fact, for the most part, it was very good. But whereas the 2600X was silky smooth at all times, the 6-core Intel CPU did suffer the odd frame stutter here and there. What's really surprising to me is the 4K data. Here, the 9400F with DDR4 2666 memory suffered big drops in performance, and this was somewhat corrected with faster memory, but even here, the 2600X did deliver a smoother experience. World of Tanks has recently been updated to better support Ryzen CPUs, and we see that the 2600X does do quite well, though oddly the base configuration did fall away at 1440p, but still with over 100 FPS at all times, the performance was very good. Performance in Metro Exodus was very competitive, and here we're certainly not able to distinguish between these two processors. This isn't the most CPU demanding game out there, but it is good to see the 2600X matching the 9400F in this modern title. Far Cry New Dawn is quite sensitive to memory latency, and tuning up the Ryzen processor really helped here. The base configuration wasn't terrible, but we did see up to a 15% performance boost from tweaking the memory and overclocking the cores. Even at 4K, the 2600X did struggle to get the most out of the RTX 2080 Ti without those tweaks. Both CPUs delivered a similar experience in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and with DDR4 3400 both were able to max out the RTX 2080 Ti at 1440p, then of course at 4K we were entirely GPU bound. Using DDR4 2666 memory, the 9400F was a little jittery in Monster Hunter World, though that issue was solved with the faster DDR4 3400 memory. The 2600X, on the other hand, had no issue, though it was only tested with DDR4 3400 memory, as the CPU has no memory limitations on any of the mainstream B or X series chipsets, but I suspect it's not really the memory that's helping out the Ryzen processor here, but rather having 12 threads is probably beneficial. Then once we increased the resolution to 1440p, the RTX 2080 Ti became the main bottleneck, and this was of course the case at 4K as well. Strange Brigade really isn't CPU intensive at all, but it is a very well optimized title and allows us to test using the Vulkan API. Overall, both CPUs performed very well, and it allows us to get the most out of the RTX 2080 Ti at all tested resolutions. Despite putting on a good show in Battlefield 5, the Ryzen 5 2600 isn't quite as nimble in Star Wars Battlefront 2, and this is despite both games using the same Frostbite game engine. The 2600X trailed the 9400F even at 1440p, though once we applied our overclock the margins were minimal. Last up we have the Division 2, and these are some very interesting results to finish up on. Using DDR4 2666 memory, the Core i5 9400F maxed out at 120 FPS on average with a 1% low of 86 FPS. Not exactly bad performance that, but the faster DDR4 3400 memory did boost the average frame rate by almost 20%, and that is quite significant. This placed the 9400F on par with the Ryzen 5 2600X, which was of course using DDR4 3400 memory for both configurations. So this title is obviously very memory sensitive, but it's also great to see it performing so well with the Ryzen processor. By the time we hit 1440p, we were GPU limited with the RTX 2080 Ti, and the same was also seen at 4K. Well, given what we just saw there, I think it's fair to say there is really no wrong option when it comes to picking either of these CPUs. They have their own strengths and weaknesses. The 9400F, I'd say that's overall a little bit faster thanks to wider game support. The Intel architecture has been more widely used, and therefore it is better supported. It also enjoys slightly lower latency, so that just gives it an edge there in quite a few titles. But the 2600X with its 12 threads did deliver a slightly smoother experience in the more demanding games. So yeah, as I said, strengths and weaknesses for each CPU. But before I get too far into it, I think it's probably best that we have a look at the average performance across all 18 games. With the advantage of faster DDR4 3400 memory, remember the 2600X isn't artificially limited, it was able to match the Core i5 9400F using DDR4 2666 memory. And this is a memory speed that the Intel CPU is limited to on all but the Z series motherboards. Of course, we can unleash the 9400F with DDR4 3400 memory on a Z series board, and this did offer up to a 5% performance boost on average, while the 1% low performance was improved by 6%. Of course, the gains were significant in some games and not that significant in others, depending on a number of factors. The 2600X basically saw the same gains when overclocked, and as you would expect, those margins were reduced for both processors at 1440p and 4K, because we are primarily GPU bound at these resolutions, and therefore we don't see a much more than a frame or two difference. So it's fair to say, in terms of gaming performance, they're both very similar, and they are both very good gaming CPUs. When it comes to application workloads though, the 2600X, it'll pretty well thrash the 9400F, and if you require any evidence of that, then you can check out our 2600X review or anyone else's 2600X reviews, because while they won't include the 9400F, they will have the 8400, the Core i5 8400, and as I said earlier, this CPU at best is a few percent. We're talking very low single digit gains. So yeah, 100 megahertz faster than 8400. So The 8400 is a good measuring stick there for how this thing will stack up to the 2600X in applications. And based on my own testing, yeah, as I said, it gets pretty well destroyed by the 12-threaded Ryzen processor. For rendering and encoding workloads, the 2600X is anywhere from 30 to 50% faster, and the Core i5 processor still can't get ahead for editing tasks either, as it doesn't enjoy a clock speed advantage. For those wondering about operating temperatures, using the box coolers, both CPUs ran at a little over 70 degrees with an ambient room temperature of just 21 degrees. However, whereas the Wraith Spire was whisper quiet in our Blender stress test, the Intel box cooler sounded like a jet engine. Therefore, ideally you will want to spend at least another $20 US on a decent box cooler to make the thing bearable, and that takes the Core i5 cost up to $195 US, pricing it on par with the 2600X. So, back to the original question, which should you buy, the Core i5-9400F or the Ryzen 5 2600X? Frankly, I feel like you're probably going to be happy with either of them. They're both solid options that have their own strengths and weaknesses. Personally though, I would stick with my original pick, which was the Ryzen 5 2600X, and there are numerous reasons for this. Firstly, for games, as we just saw, they're quite evenly matched, especially if you tune up the Ryzen processor. The base performance shown here for the Core i5-9400F can be achieved with $90 US memory. The 2600X on the other hand will require $110 to $120 US memory in order to enable the frame rate shown here, at least at 1080p. So just keep that in mind. It's not a big cost difference, and truth be told, if you had anything less than an RTX 2070 or Vega 64, it really doesn't matter anyway, as you'll more than likely be GPU limited. For me, it's really all about those 1% low results. Here the 2600X was much more consistent, but like I said, for the most part, you simply wouldn't know which processor you were using, the 9400F or the 2600X. The average graph that we just looked at sums it up pretty well for me. For most of you, the 1440p or 4K results will be representative of your gaming experience, and that is to say that you will be mostly GPU bound. There can of course be exceptions to this. Older titles, StarCraft 2 comes to mind for me. That plays much better on Intel processors, though I'm not sure that's true for this comparison. It certainly is for the unlocked parts that can hit 5 GHz, but the 9400F is limited to 4.1 GHz, so that advantage may not apply here. Moving beyond games though, it's pretty easy win for the 2600X and any kind of serious productivity workload. Yeah, it's going to destroy the 9400F. That one's pretty cut and dry. The other big win for the Ryzen processor, at least in my opinion, is the upgrade path. You've got B350, B450, X370 and X470 motherboards. There's a few other motherboards there that you probably don't want to buy, but the point is they will all support upcoming Zen 2 processors. So if you do happen to have a nice B450 board now with something like a 2600X, then you'll be able to slap on one of those upcoming Ryzen 3000 processors later in the year or whenever you deem it necessary to execute your next upgrade. On that note, at this point I would suggest holding off on any CPU purchases till the Ryzen 3000 series arrives. Not too long to wait now, finally, and yeah, I think it's just well worth waiting the extra few months to see how things pan out there. But if for whatever reason you can't wait because, well, for whatever reason, then the 2600X, I think that's probably a pretty safe bet right now. The smartest investment in my opinion for all the reasons I just mentioned. And I think that is going to do it for this one. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate the work we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. You will gain access to the monthly live stream that Tim and myself do. You'll gain access to our Discord chat. You can speak to Tim and myself there. And just your small contribution each month really helps us out because it allows us to buy things like this. So when you guys want to know how the Core i5-9400F compares to something like the Ryzen 2600X, we can buy one. Because although Intel doesn't really support us that well with samples, they don't sample these sort of CPUs to anyone. So anyone who has reviewed one of these will have bought it themselves. There's a good chance of that. So yeah, just allows us to make content like this. Anyway, I think I've said everything I need to say, apart from thank you for watching, much appreciated, and I'll see you again next time. Also, I'm your host, Steve. Did I get everything? Yeah, I got everything.